Welcome Barbara Postema from Massey University, North Island, New Zealand. I think we're like 16 hours apart or something crazy.
Huge difference, yeah.
Anyway, welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you about your work, how there's a kind of system, a language, maybe a grammar of the comics and how it makes meaning. I know this really important book for us that you published in 2013. But yeah, welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here.
Yeah, so gosh, how is it that, you got into comic studies? You're kind of one of the first, I will say, women like out of the gate doing this kind of work, right? But yeah, what's your origin story?
I was reading comics before I could read. The first comic I can remember, I guess, just sitting and looking at the picture was Asterix. And so they were always a part of my reading, always a part of kind of the literature that was there. And so growing up, I went from Asterix and Tintin and that kind of stuff to the comics grew up with me. I was reading Isler and then Möbius, but at the same time there was always Schultz, Peanuts, things like that. So yeah, I was reading them, but you weren't really learning how to study them. At school you don't talk about comics in book reports, for example. So then I was starting a BA in English, and I was writing a thesis about Paul Auster's New York trilogy. And as I was working on that contemporary American literature, someone gave me for my birthday, they gave me It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken by Seth. And I read that and just was so excited by that book and felt that the kind of analysis that I was doing for Paul Auster, for New York trilogy, I was like, wow, you could do that for this book as well, for It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. Why aren't we doing this with comics? And so that kind of got the bug in my head. And then I was, still finishing my BA and then MA. But for my PhD, I decided that what I really wanted to do was think about how comics communicate. So I went to Michigan State to do that. And that was, in part because in the Netherlands, it felt like the literary studies approaches there weren't really all that interested maybe in popular culture. And so no one else around me was doing comic studies. Whereas in the US, I found some programs that incorporated it. There was Bowling Green with a popular culture program, for example. And then at Michigan State, they had amazing special collections. And so that was what drew me. But even then, most of the courses I took were kind of traditional literature. I was studying modernism and I was studying women's writing and things like that. So I felt like I kind of had to put together my own research program to get a sense of the history of comics. And because I was at Michigan State, that was really focused on American comics. And so that's kind of what I drew on for my dissertation, which then also became my book. But I'm so grateful to Randy Scott, for example, at the special collections. Like he would, when I went in there, he's like, "Oh, have you seen this book? Have you read that book?" And so he gave me David Kunzel's early comic strip kind of history of comics or visual narrative from Hogarth to like the beginning of the 20th century. And that was so amazing to see those kinds of developments in really early comics. But my own heart coming to comic studies from contemporary literature, basically, my heart is also with contemporary comics. But knowing that background and seeing that development, really helped me kind of get my ideas together for sure.
Amazing. And you ended up in Canada for a bit, and then now you're in New Zealand.
Yeah, I was moving around where the work is, I guess. That's perhaps one of the sort of drawbacks of being a comic scholar is that the kind of training I have in literary studies, there's not always room for that in English departments. Like they have room for literary studies, obviously, but then when you say that, well, I use it to study comics, then they kind of raise an eyebrow, perhaps. So yeah, I've been through a bunch of kind of short-term contracts some sessional working, but also year-to-year assistant professor type positions. And that's now brought me to New Zealand, which has been super exciting. But again, kind of short term.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they're very excited to have you. I'm sure the students love you there. Tell me, what's the secret? So narrative structure in comics, how do comics make meaning? What did you discover, in the writing of this book and in some of these comics that you focused on, right? Jessica Abel's work, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So it took me a long time to kind of get my head around it, but in the end, the I guess the basic idea is the subtitle of that book, Making Sense of Fragments, which was also related to the title of my dissertation, Mind the Gap. So the notion that comics work by leaving stuff out. And I kind of, I broke down comics really systematically for narrative structure in comics, partly, influenced by Jerry Grunstein and the system of comics, things like that. Breaking it down like that systematically was looking at pictures, looking at sequences, word image combinations, and then sort of narrative as a whole. And the idea that that kind of pulled all these things together for me was that in each of those levels, or in each of those different ways of reading comics, things that are left out, the gaps that are left, are one of the key ways in which you're kind of drawn in as a reader, and in which things are meant to make sense. So for images, since you have cartooning in comics, it's partly abstraction, partly subtraction. Things are left out in order that the things that are there become extra important. With sequences, obviously you have the gutters, so there's always key things, key moments that are not visible because they happen between the gutters, and it's up to you as a reader to put those things together. There's perhaps a gap between the word and image. You have to see how they fit together. What are the words saying about the images? What information are the images providing about the words? There's things that are being bridged there as well. And then in narrative as a whole, of course, there's always gaps. There's big jumps in time, sometimes big events that are left out on purpose, like with a detective story. And that's something that you see with La Perdida, for example, by Jessica Abel. She starts that book with quite a lot of suspense. This woman who is, for some reason, is really nervous about being in this Mexican area in Chicago, and then feels that she recognizes someone and immediately kind of runs away, gets on the train, and it's set up as there's this gap. Why is she so afraid? And then the story kind of goes back to the beginning, starts at the beginning, and it's filling that in. But all the way through, there's these little visual clues, like the little skeleton puppet that she has, that keep drawing things together, that kind of reassure it's all still the same story, but you still don't know why she was so afraid to begin with, because her early time in Mexico City, she's just in awe of everything, wanting to see the Frida Kahlo house, and all that kind of stuff, really embracing that. And so for a long time, you're still like, well, what's the scary stuff? And that's kind of what you're waiting for. And of course you get to that eventually. And so narrative gaps are kind of supported by all these other gaps that comics.
Yeah, Barbara, was there a comic setup, layout that surprised you, given that you were looking very carefully at, say, systems maybe of meaning? Was there something that kind of stood out that actually kind of maybe proved the rule to you?
I guess one page layout that I really like is the iconostasis, where you have a whole page that you can read as linear. You can just follow the panels, and there's an action happening, maybe a discussion going on, but you can also look at the whole page as one moment, or as one picture, and then you see that it's, that it shows a whole room, or an entire face that otherwise you were looking at in fragments. So the way, I guess, the way that fragments can actually fit together is something that iconostasis, those kinds of pages, really draw attention to. And in my teaching, I often use Neil Gaiman's book with, is it Dave McKean? I can't think of the top of my head. Black Orchid, that uses iconostasis quite a bit. And so that's, it's great to have those examples to show students. It has a fairly set grid. It tends to be the 9-panel grid, but then once in a while the page just opens up, and things are kind of floating around, or those 9 panels that seem so strict suddenly are also altogether a single picture. So yeah, I think those are sort of showing that crossing of filling in of gaps in action, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was talking to Paul Gravette, and he brought up a panel, and he's talking about it as the DeLuca effect. But yeah, this narrative structure, right? I think didn't it launch the kind of graphic novel comics series there with RIT?
Yeah, so Rochester Institute of Technology Press. Yeah. This was the first book in that series. And now I think there are maybe 5. I think there's a book that's just been launched that has frames in the title. That I'm really interested to read that one, actually, because it seems to be pretty formal approach to comics in a way that I'm doing myself, so that I'm always interested in. And some of the books in between were about crime comics and comics in the 1950s and 60s. So yeah, they've got quite a range of things going on there.
And of course, it was the importance of your book, not only launching a significant book series to really open up this field, but of course, it's translation into Portuguese for a Brazilian market, right? So exciting.
Yeah, that was very exciting.
Yeah, I love that. Sort of the travel, you traveling, and then your work traveling into new languages, other spaces. So let's, your system, your kind of structure, your formal approach, how would you walk me or walk us viewers through the Shutterbug Follies, what would be an example here? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you have here maybe the very first page of Shutterbug Follies by Jason Little. So one of the things that I think is notable here. So you have, I think the first thing your eye gets drawn to is that Mulberry photo sign. So you're dealing with a photography shop, but then it has the arch around it, and behind that arch you can see in both top corners, you can see the kind of tall buildings, so that there's a really urban space being set up here, even though that the closer look at the Mulberry photo doesn't include all that space, but it's behind there, it's hovering over it. So you know that you're in an urban setting here. I would take from this as well. So Mulberry being a street in formerly immigrant neighborhood in Manhattan. So it's not, it's not any Mulberry anywhere. It's not a random word. Now all of a sudden we're in New York, we're in Manhattan, in this bustling place. And then that first arched panel and the panel kind of in the store will have kind of odd angles, as not kind of straight, so you're really swooping in. So there's a lot of energy in those first panels, and then in the middle panel you're already seeing Bee in the background, and then you kind of get close to her, seeing her at work. And so that's the first introduction of who's the person who's going to be the main character in this book. So at this point you really don't have information about her. just maybe from the cover of the book that you know that she's going to be the main character. But you see her, you know, really bent over this machine, hard at work, clearly has, you know, some technical training there with her lab coat and her gloves. And then there's the film that's drying next to her or hanging there, I guess, prepared to be put into the machine to make more prints. So visually, those are the things that you get from there. And then you get the first speech balloon. "Oh, photo processing machine, I command you to reveal to me that which is hidden." And there again, that says a lot about this character. She's kind of, you know, the way that she treats the machine as a magical device. There's a quirkiness about her, so that she seems to maybe make her job that could be sort of boring, sitting there, click, 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 just at the machine. She turns that into something exciting. And then, of course, if you read the rest of the book, that's also a moment that becomes really significant, because she starts using those photographs that she's developing to solve this mystery that she stumbles on because she's looking at these photographs. So it's, in some way, it is the photo processing machine that helps her solve the crime, the murder, actually, in this book. So there's also that, you know, there's a hint of what's to come, which is also, when I read comics, I'm always leaping back and forth, checking things that I already read. But now that I have more information, like, oh, actually, there was something going on there that I hadn't noticed. Let me look at that page again. This word balloon is one of those moments where, it, you know, when you read the book again, or when you turn back to that page, like, all this information was there. I knew how she was going to do this. I just had to read the rest to find out exactly how that was going to work. So, you know, that's some of the things that the image and text are doing here together. Shutterbug Follies, to me, is also very much sort of bubblegum noir in its genre, and that speaks from the way that the color in this page really pops as well. It's so vibrant. It's, you know, when I say bubblegum noir, the noir is really not coming from the kind of the filmic black and white shadows. It's coming more from the darkness of the story, and the story does get quite dark. And the bubblegum is from the colors and from Bee's character and that kind of stuff.
Well, in the same way that she's asking for something to be revealed, you just revealed to us how this page works. So thank you. And I know you're also very interested in not just in comics that have sort of photographic kind of elements in the content, but also kind of photographic effect, but work on silent comics. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about this. This is a really exciting area, I think, that needs you. Yeah.
Well, I hope so. I don't know, but I'm definitely very excited about silent comics, in part because they force you to read images. So with other kinds of comics, you could almost get away sometimes with mainly focusing on the text. Often when I have students write essays about comics, for example, what they'll be quoting is text balloons, and they not necessarily spend a lot of time talking about what the images are. You know, again, it's partly how we're trained. We're used to reading text and to analyzing text, and the images can be maybe a little bit scary. So when you're looking at silent comics, the images are all you have. You have to look at those. And so I'm trying to work out, you know, what kinds of communication, what kinds of storytelling are happening there. And the three images that you've got here, I think, are really interesting because they show some of the extremes, some of the really different ways in which silent comics make stories. So the city is a very early one from maybe 1910s or early 1920s by Fons Mazadale, and that's being a woodcut novel. It has a single panel per page, and so these panels work more almost like showing different scenes, showing snapshots, and you've got pretty large gaps to cover from one panel to the next. And so the city is also a story that works quite impressionistically in some ways. Then Peter Kuper's The System, which you have in the middle there, also very much a city story, really. But Peter Kuper makes a very exciting silent comic, but much more traditional in the way that it uses panels and page layouts. Although this particular page, you see that the panels are actually being ripped apart in the explosion that's being shown. Peter Kuper is also interesting in The System because the system is a very complicated story. It really is about a number of sort of systems that are working together. And so he helps the reader by having newspaper headlines and posters and like flash headlines on TVs, just to help you kind of keep track on all the different players and how they relate to each other in that story. And then there's The Great War by Joe Sacco, which is just almost an overwhelming piece. It's this whole long fold out comic that on the one hand you could read it as a single moment, but it also takes you through the entire battle of a kind of a single day in World War I. And I forget which particular day it is. It was a historical battle, but on the one side, I think it's probably on the left, you have this colonel or general standing in the beautiful garden of some kind of country mansion, and then it takes you closer and closer to the front, and you see more and more soldiers, and then you get to the trenches, and then there's the actual battle going on with people shooting each other and things blowing up, and then on the other side you get the wounded being carried away to hospital tents, and then a graveyard. So all of that is being shown in a single continuing strip of paper, but it also has all these key moments. So it's a very powerful way of capturing what happened probably almost on a daily basis in some cases during World War I, all just shown in pictures and no words at all necessary to kind of feel that impact.
Yeah, so powerful. So Barbara, you talking about students, can you share some of your methods in the actual classroom? And I was thinking about two that you talk about in your work, Skim and then the Groom. But yeah, what's the Barbara sort of method for getting your students to understand how these make meaning?
Yeah, when I get to teach a course that's only comics, which is a lovely thing to do, and it doesn't happen all that often for me. But then in a course like that, I guess I do use sort of the structure of my own book a little bit as a structure for the course as well. I want students to learn how to read images and look really close at what's going on just in the pictures, and then start putting those things together with the panels, the page layouts, and then where that gets you in terms of reading a story as a whole. And Skim is really nice to teach because it's very fluid in the way it does page layouts, and so there keep being very surprising new ways in which suddenly sometimes all the backgrounds disappear, or suddenly it shows the same person 5 times on a single page, and other places it has pretty standard panel layouts, like here, although again there's almost like a circular thing going on around the fire in the middle, so you see all these people standing looking into the fire, and you have the fire going on in the middle that they're all standing around. One funny thing about Skim is also that it has, when there's night scenes, it has black gutters, and when there's day scenes, it has white gutters, and so it's almost performative in the way that it uses those gutters. So I like to draw attention to the materiality of comics as well, that Skim is a story that's sort of the diary of this young woman in her, as she's in high school. And if you have the hardcover version of this book, and you take off the dust jacket, then the book itself looks like a diary as well, and it's got her kind of scribblings on it. So comics kind of break down text and paratext. The covers, the dust jackets even, or the end pages, they can already be kind of brought into action to work to help tell the story. So yeah, I try to, you know, these are all things that I don't lecture. I don't say, now look at this, now look at that. But in the conversations, things come up. And, you know, it happens pretty regularly with books that students will notice details that I hadn't noticed before and that open up a completely new reading. So that's part of the kind of the exciting thing when you teach literature in general, but certainly when you teach comics. But they're works to be read and reread, and you can keep finding new things.
And of course, the Groom is a web comic, which, you know,
Yes.
in many ways, especially right now with lockdowns and stuff, so on, probably more accessible to our students.
Yeah, and so that, you know, it's accessible to students. They've often read a lot more webcomics than I have, and so they'll have a lot of examples. I like having presentations when I teach comics because students will come in and talk about series comics that I'd not been aware of and that are super exciting. They're kind of new stuff that's going on, and that way, again, you partly you can talk about the materiality. Reading a webcomic is quite different. It has different things that it can do. I'm trying to think of the word that Henry Jenkins uses for that. I think it's affordances. So, you know, scrolling through a comic, Emily Carroll plays with that a little bit. With the Groom, she kind of goes back and forth between, here you see something that's almost photographic and then things that are black and white. And then there's a page, or when you click through to that page, suddenly it's color and it's so different. And because you're online and you hadn't, you know, flipped through it yet, it really comes as almost a shock. Whereas in a book, you can often see from the side, like, oh, there's something coming later that's not black or that is black. You have these sections that you can already see on the cut pages. So, and with some of her story, Emily Carroll also has you have to scroll down, but then you get a dead end if you scroll down. So then you have to figure out, you're kind of scrolling in the dark, like the character is. So then you have to go sideways and then maybe down again to find the path to read. So it's a very different way of reading, but you're still actually really, you have to be active. Again, Erin Kashtan does some really interesting work about the materiality of digital comics that I think is quite interesting and helpful with, I haven't used him for teaching yet, but if I get to teach comics as a focus again, I would certainly consider that.
Exciting, very exciting web comics, all that you're doing. Gosh, you're so involved. You also have a book series that you're co-editing. We love the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics. I presented there last year.
Oh, that's great.
As the keynote. Where is for you the vitality in comics and comic studies? Yeah.
For me, and it's partly, I'm sort of a social person, but part of the vitality is definitely in the community of scholars. And so things like the CSSC, the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics, and now the CSS as well, those really help build those communities. And I think they're really important to bring scholars together in, you know, from students through to all kinds of levels of professors. Just talking to each other and sharing ideas is so important. And yeah, the CSSC has now, you know, when I was running it, we were always concurrent with TCAF, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. And so part of the community we got from there as well, able to, you know, people that came to our conferences would also be able to go to the the comics festival and meet various cartoonists and authors and things like that. Now the CSSC has moved to the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences in Canada. So we're part of Congress now, which is where all the humanities and social sciences, those associations in Canada all have their conferences in the same roughly 2-week period. And so you get a very different sense of community now, much more focused, I guess, on academia. And I think that's also asserting, comic studies it's here to stay. It's part of academic disciplines. People that are studying communications or English, they can all pop into our comic studies events as well and see what's going on there. So I think that was a very important move that Ben Wu took care of very well to get the CSSC established there and continuing there. Now, of course, everything is up in the air this year. There's no Congress. And I guess, some associations might run things online. But yeah, we've at least had a good start. And I was sorry to miss your keynote there because, I was too far away I had to miss.
Yeah, and crossing lines is so important. For a number of reasons. One of them is that it's all women that co-edit. It's got a very transnational focus, but also really has gender and race and sexuality as a kind of primary drive.
Yes.
So yeah, what's coming out with Crossing Lines? What's exciting there for you?
I'm excited about the collaboration. We're still sort of in the early days. So we're very much still in the process of soliciting manuscripts and proposals as well. But the way that comic studies is becoming so big that you can have all these different foci now is really exciting. And this one, the transcultural, transnational, is something that's obviously close to my heart. Being somewhat transnational in the way that I keep jumping around and moving around as well. And I think it's a really, really important area of study because we've been fairly focused on, I guess, various national streams of comics, American comics, Franco-Belgian comics, Japanese manga, that kind of stuff. And so now thinking more about how these things are also crossing boundaries, connecting across borders, and have intersections going on there. I'm really excited about those kinds of directions that are happening now. And, we're just one of a number of new series that are coming out from different presses. So that again shows the vitality, the number of conferences we have now, the number of journals, and the numbers of book series and just books that are coming out. When I was doing my comprehensive exams, I felt like, I'm pretty much on top of what's going on in comic studies. I've got I can see the whole picture. Right now, it's wow, there's so many different things, so many different approaches. So I think, just by looking at those kinds of metrics almost, you can see the vitality that's there.
Barbara, the sort of proverbial nightstand question, what comics do you have on your nightstand or that you're thinking about or that have you thinking a lot about them?
I've got the Eternauta by Oosterheld, which I've had for quite a while. It's kind of a big, bulky book, and it's also, it's quite a few decades old now, so it's a different way of reading, but that's definitely a book that I'm slowly making my way through. And that seems maybe right now particularly kind of prescient because people are also, at least in the beginning, they're kind of stuck in their homes and don't know if they can get out because the air is poisonous. So yeah, I think I always try to read some things where I feel like I'm filling some gaps in my knowledge from way back, and that can that often includes superheroes, which I'm not terribly well read in, but also comics from elsewhere that maybe have finally come up in translation, and then current comics is something, you know, especially comics by women. I'm always excited to find new ones. And right now there are so many online comics. Yesterday I was reading, Lisa Hannawalt had I think it was called Pride and Pestilence. So she's coping with being locked in by watching Pride and Prejudice and reading Pride and Prejudice endlessly, kind of looping and looping, and that's helping her get through through the pandemic. And it's, you know, that's just a short comic, but it was so powerful. So that, yeah, again, the range of stuff that's there, old stuff that I'm still discovering, new stuff that people are making, you know, just maybe almost as a venting mechanism, and that are yet really, really touching and profound to read. So yeah, it's a great time for comics in that sense.
It is. It's almost overwhelming, right? And
Yeah.
I was just talking to a friend, and they said, well, what novels have you been reading? And actually, I find the real vitality, of course, there's some that are not so good, but, you know, for the most part, the big bang for the buck is comics and graphic novels and graphic fiction and nonfiction and autobiography. I honestly, fiction, every once in a while, alphabetic fiction surprises me, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm spending most of my time in this space that you just talked about. Barbara, gosh, thank you for beaming in from
Thank you.
the North Island of New Zealand, Massey University. Thank you, Barbara Postema, for joining.
My great pleasure. Thank you.